My main motivation, Mr. President, was around Article 1 of the Omnibus Bill, and we didn't talk a lot about it. We heard Senator Putnam introduce the agriculture part of the bill, and there's money in here for southeastern Minnesota, which is where I come from, southeastern Minnesota. And this is expressing, and members, legislatures will do this often. They will see a group, sometimes a small group, which I will admit is the case in southeastern Minnesota, jump up and down and raise all kinds of excitement about their disagreement with something, and get the legislature, or in this case, the majority in the legislature, to act. As a matter of fact, members, we had some far-left environmental organizations, 11 of them, write a petition to the Environmental Protection Agency, and organizations including the MCEA and the Land Stewardship Project, who receive millions of dollars from millionaires and billionaires throughout this country, all the way from Silicon Valley to Chicago to New York and beyond. And they brought a petition to the Environmental Protection Agency. I should back up. Actually, MCEA, as I understand it, sued the Environmental Protection Agency years before that, and then just recently they brought a petition to the Environmental Protection Agency urging them to do something because in their estimate there were nitrate problems in the water in southeast Minnesota. So the Environmental Protection Agency, so we had these, which is largely Democrats in the far left environmental organizations, sue the Democrats in the EPA in Washington and say, we don't like what's going on here, you have to do something. So what the Democrats in Washington did at the EPA is they came out to southeastern Minnesota and they did 2 raids on 2 dairy farms in southeast Minnesota, unannounced raids, trying to find all kinds of bad things that these farmers were doing and what kind of things were they doing to pollute the water, etc. Well, they found nothing, Mr. President, but only days later after those raids, the EPA issued a letter to the state government, the Democrats in state government, in the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the Department of Agriculture and Department of Health and Governor Walz, and said, you guys have to do something because these Democrats in the MCEA and Land Stewardship Project want us to act, and we want you to act, and we don't think you're doing a good enough job of protecting people around the water quality standards that have been established both federally and at the state level. Well, the area they were talking about is the nitrate requirements, members, or the nitrate standards. And in our country, the nitrate standard is set at 10 parts per million, or 10 micrograms per liter, however you want to express it. And they came out and said that the state government isn't doing a good enough job and they need to act. Now, we have to remember that nitrates and nitrogen, and I heard Senator Putnam call it pollution. Well, I think what we need to remember is that nitrogen is a naturally occurring element in our world and in our atmosphere. As a matter of fact, 78% of the atmosphere, members, is nitrogen. Matter of fact, the background level in our groundwater varies between 2 and 3 or 3.5% nitrates regularly. So the correct term, Senator Putnam and other members, would be elevated nitrates. And it's not pollution, it's a naturally occurring element that if you go back to your core earth sciences in college, is expressed as a nitrogen cycle, which goes from one form of nitrogen to another, forms a nice circle, and comes back around again. But we have a limit that has been placed on this by the Environmental Protection Agency of 10 parts per million, which, members, Some scientists believe we should actually raise to 20 parts per million. They believe 10 parts per million is actually too low. As a matter of fact, the World Health Organization has the nitrate standard for their use set at 50 parts per million, 5 times higher than the low 10 part per million number that is expressed by the Environmental Protection Agency and that we are talking about here today. Now, MCEA and Land Stewardship Project, using the millions that they got from donors throughout the country to advocate for what they are advocating for, came forward and said, do something. And that's what we have going on before us here in the legislature, members. I think context, though, members, is very important. So, in 1947, 48, and 49, Minnesota had a real crisis for nitrogen, not this made-up one that MCEA and the other far-left environmental Democrat organizations are bringing forward for us today. But we had a real crisis in Minnesota. As a matter of fact, over those 3 years, Mr. President, we had, and you can read the research piece that was put together in March of 1950 by the U of M, but we had nearly 150 different wells in different cases of, these are private wells. In that case, back then, Mr. President, it was in southwest Minnesota, not southeast Minnesota, but southwest Minnesota. Members, Mr. President, back then, we were just learning about nitrates and their potential effect on babies. And so what we had back then in southwest Minnesota was lots of wells that were located too close to the septic systems. And so we had nitrates that were finding their way to the wells from the septic systems, and we had babies that were getting very, very sick, and the scientific community, Mr. President, was trying to figure out what it was that was going on. And they weren't talking, members, about 10 parts per million back then as they measured the nitrate levels. They were talking about 50 parts per million and 100 parts per million and 200 parts per million and 400 parts per million, and one well that had a sick baby that was 500 parts per million. That was in the late 1940s. And so the scientific community, the doctors, the medical community learned at that point in time in Minnesota what nitrates and nitrate ingestion for babies and the ability for methemoglobinemia to develop meant. And since then, we have made light years of movement from then. As a matter of fact, today, members, even though the MCEA and the Land Stewardship Project and the other 9 radical leftist organizations that brought the petition to get the action to spend money for us to do something, they brought forward, I lost my train of thought, members. So we have today, the light years that we have come forward, members, is indicative of what we have. Even though these organizations were clamoring to do something, when they're clamoring to do something, they were saying, we have blue baby syndrome in Minnesota, and these nitrates that are in the well at 10 parts per million or 12 or 15 or maybe 20 parts per million, which is a long way from 500 parts per million, Mr. President, that even though we had nitrate levels that high, today, my question to you, members, and to you, Mr. President, is where are the blue babies in Minnesota? As a matter of fact, even back in the 1940s and 50s, when they were dealing with the crisis back then, which was a real crisis, they learned that if a baby is sick from blue baby syndrome. You simply give it good water, and guess what? It goes away. Well, just recently in the last year, when MCEA and the other radical organizations brought out their scary stuff and started talking about blue babies, and I talked to my neighbors, they were assuming if there was a blue baby out there that the blue baby died. They assumed everyone was a dead blue baby. As a matter of fact, it couldn't be farther from the truth. Back then in the 1950s, the vast majority of them were cured within days, and they were back to normal life. And as a matter of fact, today, we don't have blue babies in Minnesota anymore. The latest data that we have, Mr. President and members, is a sampling the Minnesota Department of Health did between 2000 and 2016. They found 17 blue babies in 16 years. 17 blue babies in 16 years. And during the hearings with the Water Commission and other places in this legislature, within the last year, Mr. President, the Minnesota Department of Health was asked, can you show us the blue babies that we have in Minnesota today and where they're from? How many are from southeast Minnesota? How many of them were from drinking well water in these 6 counties or 7 counties, however many we've got that are included here? We still haven't heard, Mr. President, from the Minnesota Department of Health. You know why? Because they don't have any blue babies today. And the people bringing this forward are bringing forward something that is false. As a matter of fact, we don't have a problem with this here in Minnesota today, but we have a bill before us that has to do something. And I brought a bill too, Mr. President, earlier that did something in order to try to divert the negative energy that was accruing to the farmers and the good people of southeastern Minnesota. As a matter of fact, the agricultural practices that the MCEA and the other radical organizations keep bringing forward have improved in the last 30 to 50 years, and the water movement through soil takes largely 30 to 50 years before it hits the groundwater in many situations. Mr. President, the water quality is improving as the agricultural practices have improved in the last 30 to 50 years. We will see that continue to accrue as time moves forward and that 30 to 50 years is actually realized here in the state of Minnesota and in southeastern Minnesota. Our farmers are doing the best job in terms of the environment that they've done here in the history of this country, this state, in the world. And for us to not acknowledge those realities, instead have this reflexive reaction to simply do something because our base, certainly not my base, but the base of this legislature, the majorities in this legislature, is squawking and telling them they have to act, is ridiculous. Instead, we need to go back to science. And I outlined the history. I hope that the members of this legislature start to acknowledge that to a greater degree than we have. And, Mr. President, I'm wondering if Senator Putnam would yield for a question.
Senator Putnam is not in the chambers.
Mr. President, is Senator Putnam an author of this bill?
The author is Friends, because it's his bill, and the others were added on to the bill, but he's not on the floor.
Mr. President, is Senator Putnam the author of the Agriculture Omnibus that's a part of this omnibus?
Senator Putnam has provisions in the bill. His bill is rolled into this omnibus bill.
Okay, Mr. President, where is Senator Putnam? I'd like to talk to the chair of the committee, the author of this major segment of this omnibus bill.
Senator Jaskowski, you asked me a question I don't know the answer to. You asked me if he's on the floor. He's not on the floor. Senator Jaskowski.
Wow, Mr. President. Well, Mr. President, I guess I'm not going to get to ask Senator Putnam because he's not on the floor during this major discussion of a major bill that he is leading. So I guess that's all I have today, Mr. President and members. You have heard from me and somebody who's actually from southeastern Minnesota, and I hope that we can act with less impulse and reflexivity and instead act with something that is more measured and based in science. Thank you, Mr. President.